this computer. Okay, so this is, welcome everybody to the first meeting of the Jijang Bosal Book Club, which one could call the Jizo Bodhisattva Book Club or the Ksitigarbha Book Club. And if anybody speaks Vietnamese, they could use whatever the Vietnamese name is. Or you could say the Earth Store Bodhisattva Book Club or something like that. But I'm used to saying Jijang, so I'm going to say the Jijang Bosal Book Club. I don't know if anybody has any initial questions or things they want to bring up before we start. I've got, PowerPoint slides, how exciting. But we're going to be talking about the opening chapters of the Ksitigarbha Sutra. Now, I said I was going to say Jijang, but there I just said Ksitigarbha, because when you talk about the sutra, generally that's what people call it, the Ksitigarbha Sutra. At least that's what I've always heard people call it, which I don't necessarily expect people to have. Well, who here has read any of the Ksitigarbha Sutra? All right, okay, so excellent. So should we just dive in? Do people want to, I mean, since you've all read some of it, you might have like initial questions or things that you want to bring up.
I have a few things I wrote down.
Yeah.
Was somebody else going to talk? Did I hear another voice? Is that okay?
I think you have the floor, Blythe.
I was just saying.
I found, I know you had referenced it.
Mm-hmm.
But I had not read the sutra until I started reading for this, for this first assignment. And I need to get hell straight. It's, I kind of balked at the, it's like, it made me think of fundamentalism. And the idea that if you are not doing exactly what's right or what I've told you, you're going to suffer torturous things. And here's some examples. So I guess what I was struggling, in fact, I wrote down Avicii. Do you say Avicii or Avicii hell?
Avicii hell. Yeah, that's the bad one.
Unceasing sufferings. Last of the 8 hot hells. Punishment continues without intermission. And so I wrote about 3 pages of like exclamation points on hells. So I'm a little bit stuck in hell.
Yeah.
So I get it. I remember you had said that it has a lot of that in there.
Yep.
And so if you could give some sense of like the yaksas, other demons, and there's so much detail and descriptive. It seems to be making such a big deal out of that part versus in a karmic sense or whatever, there can be suffering as a result of things that happen to it.
Right.
I mean, can you help me with the hell that they do? But
yes.
That would be my main thing. I don't need to read you all. But I had
okay.
3 pages of.
Well, so let's talk about it. It doesn't have to just be me, but and then keep those pages open. And if there's anything that we don't get to, that we don't address, bring us back to that. But I just want to say, first of all, that one of the themes of the Ksitigarbha Sutra and of Jizo or Jijang in general is that this is a bodhisattva who is dedicated to helping the people who need the most help. And so one of the reasons why there's a great emphasis on hells is because samsara is the realm of suffering, okay? And so the hell realms are where there's the most suffering. There's upper realms of samsara that are still part of samsara, but there's very, very little or no suffering in those realms. They're impermanent. And so this sutra, although there's a lot of talk about hell realms, it actually takes place in a heavenly realm. So, which is another thing that can be kind of off-putting to people, especially people coming from a Western, possibly Christian background, heaven and hell. I mean, wait a minute. I thought if I wanted heaven and hell, I could just be a Christian, right? I could go to Baptist church and get all the heaven and hell you could
Right.
possibly
It just
stand.
sounds so much like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So the the um the reason why that plays a big role in the Ksitigarbha Sutra is because it is part of his job description, basically, that no matter how bad off somebody is, and in particular, that he is dedicated not only to helping the beings in hell, but to going there himself. And part one of his vows is that if I don't go to hell to save the beings there, who will? Um, and so the hells can be, and they're certainly described in the Ksitigarbha Sutra in fairly literal terms, in fact, in grotesquely literal terms. But we all experience hell realms. Um, uh, and one of, and this will be on one of the slides that I've got prepared, that whether it's after you're dead or in this lifetime, hell is always in the mind, and our minds experience tremendous suffering in the course of our lives. I mean, one of the things about the human realm, and we'll talk about this too, is that there's a mixture of suffering and happiness, which is important. Um, but there's tremendous capacity for. I mean, I hate to even talk about it, but I have to think of Zen Master Degak's daughter, Gretchen, who's just suffered a stroke. My mother suffered a stroke and suffered terribly for over a year before she finally died. And she, I mean, that is as much of a hell realm as I would ever want to imagine. And it was hell for her sons as well, to see her in that state. And so, eh, that's real. And so unless Buddhism addresses that level of suffering, then it doesn't really address our situation. And so in addressing that level of suffering, there's all kinds of stories and imagery that's used to get people's attention to some extent. But so, I mean, that kind of suffering is very real. People suffer terribly in this world. And Jijang Bosal and the teachings of Buddhism are that suffering occurs in response to our bad karma. Now, I don't think, oh, what did my mother do to deserve to have a stroke, or what did Gretchen do? And that's not what the teachings of karma are meant for. They're meant for us to not look elsewhere when we suffer, not look for people to blame or people to attack or people to attack or blame is the main thing that we're trying not to do when we suffer, but to look within. But yeah, that the so there is, I mean, there is a common theme that is a very slippery slope, and you want to be very careful with it in whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or whatever. There is some sort of cosmic justice at work there. But for Jijang Bosal, the issue is not what did you do to deserve the suffering that you're experiencing, but Jijang Bosal's attitude is always, how can I help? How can I help no matter what? And he's especially, in fact, Jijang Bosal is especially dedicated to the people who accumulate bad karma, suffer terrible uh, uh, results, suffering from that bad karma, manage somehow to overcome that, get into a better situation, and then do it again. And I've been there. That and actually that's even worse. Hell is bad enough, but then if you get out and you find yourself going back into it again, and I think that we've all experienced that. that sinking feeling when you know that it's getting bad again. Yeah, and that's what. At least in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why this plays such a prominent role in the description of Jijang Bosal, is because that level of suffering is very real, and unless Buddhism addresses that, then it doesn't have meaning for people who suffer like that. Yeah, yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I didn't want to over talk on anyway. Sort of having thoughts about, and also maybe in the same way that the New Testament is written as well, that how much of this, when it was originally written, was used in a marketing sense
Yeah.
to get people to behave better, and and how it may have been directed, because they tell us now that, well, the four gospels were written for specific groups of people, and that's why you've got some stories in there and others not. So I find that interesting, because it's funny, in regards to the New Testament, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what they did. But when I look at a sutra, I guess I think, oh, well, this is like scripture. and I shouldn't be, doubting or throwing in these concepts, right? Because it's Buddhist scripture.
Yeah, well, it's Buddhist scripture, but it's been maintained. So even if you, which I tend to do, even if you accept that the Buddha himself actually taught all of the Mahayana sutras, which many people doubt, many people who are good Buddhists, say, well, no, not really. That was written afterwards by other people who are kind of rephrasing or updating or whatever. But I tend to believe that, if you take something like the Ksitigarbha Sutra, and so Blythe brought up the whole issue of hells, but this issue of heavenly realms is very important too, because the Ksitigarbha Sutra is not taught on earth; it's taught up in heaven. And so, are we supposed to believe that? And so, even if you, as I do, tend to accept a literal interpretation of the sutras as one of the levels on which they should be understood, not the only way. But even then, these weren't written down in the time of the Buddha. They weren't written down for hundreds of years after the time of the Buddha. And they were, maintained in India, in a culture where when things were written down, they were often written down in very fragile, like on leaves, literally. And things got a little bit better actually when Buddhism came to China, where they were much more into printing, actually, for going back a long time. Well, in fact, Chinese Buddhists were very good at printing. But in Chinese Buddhism, what happened was that they tended to have more reliable, even typesetting, but they ended up with multiple different translations of all these sutras. And so which one of these is correct? And the translations are often quite free and interpretive. And so, yeah, we don't have to accept every word that's said even if you think the Buddha taught this, still we don't necessarily have exactly the exact words straight from the Buddha. We can trust that the people who've maintained this for us have done their best and have done a good job, and we need to rely on them. But we don't have to accept everything that's stated. I don't know. Does that address what you're getting at, Joe?
Yeah. I guess maybe I'm a little cynical about all scriptures, and exactly what you were saying, about Buddhist sutras and whatnot. Did the Buddha say that? The same thing with like Christian gospels; those weren't written down for how many generations
Yeah.
after the fact, right?
Yeah.
But was was there a King James equivalent like Emperor Wu or someone who said, "Oh well, we're gonna translate this
Mm-hmm.
to fit our dominion and our."
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would say one of the advantages that Buddhism has is that Buddhists are very have not tried to insist upon uh, getting and in fact, even when Buddhists in China and India and Tibet and whatever have periodically come along and said, let's get all of this organized and let's establish which of these books are really the sutras, which ones are questionable, and which ones are made up. And and that project is never completely finished, and it's never completely accepted by everyone. And people come along in the next generation and move things around and say, what do you mean this wasn't a real sutra? Of course, this is one of the most important ones. And so Buddhism has always been fairly lacking in terms of like really highly centralized authority, although people have tried to do that, but it's never really succeeded. And so you end up with lots of interesting sutras floating around that some people question and others accept. And anyway, it's
Right. Or they find another cave in Mongolia that has all kinds
yes, they
of
do.
wooden blocks in it for the printing.
Yeah.
So it's all very interesting in a human sort of condition of what we do
Uh-huh.
with information. But also one last question on that,
Mm-hmm.
because it seems to me that in today's Buddhism,
Uh-huh.
and obviously we're more of a Zen tradition,
Mm-hmm.
there's less emphasis on this. Could it be, though, that in the earlier days, there was perhaps more of a connection to the Hinduism and some of their beliefs about suffering and afterlife and what you would go through
Mm-hmm.
upon your death? More of a connection with that past or connection opposed to where we are now.
Yeah, I mean the ideas about rebirth and heavenly realms and hell realms were already there, and the Buddha accepted them and used them. Now he didn't just completely take them as is, and then there's a lot of people have a lot of, and of course the Hindus weren't writing things down either. So so we basically know something about, and actually to say the Hinduism as we know it now didn't really exist in the form that we have it now at the time of the Buddha. Things were evolving, and Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and other spiritual traditions all evolved together in India, eh, somewhat harmoniously. They would argue. Sometimes they would fight. Um, Often they would debate. Often they would steal ideas from each other, and it's very interesting. But yeah, you can you can make it even more. You can make it as complicated as you want, and which is you shouldn't oversimplify it. But at some point, you have to kind of limit your scope, and also you have to try to figure out, what does this mean to me? What could this possibly have to do with my life? How can this be put into practice in my life and in my spiritual practice? Not just in my spiritual practice sitting on the cushion, but in my daily life. So that helps to keep it real. Um, what does hell have to do? What do heavenly realms have to do? What does rebirth have to do with and I would say not nothing, but at the same time you have to look for that grounding. I want to oh yeah, here. I do want to share my screen. I just want to show something that I wrote. It kind of in somewhat in anticipation of some of this discussion. And put it over here, and then let's see, slideshow, current slide. All right. All right. So let me just go over a couple of things, and then we'll take a break actually in a few minutes. Will we? Yeah, we will in about 8 minutes. There's a lot of emphasis on hell realms in the Ksitigarbha Sutra. In fact, another name for Jijang Bosal is the Hell Bodhisattva. If I do not enter hell to save beings there who will. And then this is just part of what I was trying to emphasize before. The point is that no matter how bad our situation is, or I think even more importantly, how badly we have acted in the past, Jijang Bosal is committed to helping us, and Jijang Bosal is especially concerned with those who just simply can't get it right. You know, they're like fish; they get caught in a net, then they get free, and then they get caught in another net. The beings of Jambudvipa, which is where we are, have strong habits of doing evil actions. No sooner have they left the lower realms, they go back again. This requires this. So this is Shakyamuni Buddha talking, describing Jijang Bosal. This requires Jijang Bosal to work hard through many kalpas in guiding them across to liberation. Now, and here's a couple of different ways of looking at, why Buddhists talk about hell, because this isn't just in the Ksitigarbha Sutra. Okay, one reason that I didn't mention before is that if you have the idea of rebirth, people often take that as a very comforting, as a very reassuring idea. That you get a do-over, no matter how badly you screw up this life, you get to come back and try again, and that's actually a very common view of the Buddhist view of rebirth, emphasizing the fact that your next time might not be so good is a way of getting people's attention and trying to force people to focus on this life, which is might be a little counterintuitive. It's a view of the afterlife that actually is saying, well, don't count on the afterlife. You better get it right now. Or as one of my favorite sayings of any modern Buddhist teacher is Ruth Denison, who said, "Karma means you don't get away with nothing." And this is what a point that I was making earlier is that, hell realms, no matter what's described in these gory, sadistic descriptions of hell realms, we experience them, in this human life, and all that suffering comes from the mind, whether it's in this life or in a hell realm in our next lives. And then it's also not necessary to have the contrast of the hell realms and the heavenly realms in order to emphasize what's really important about the human realm. Because in the hell realms is basically a realm of incessant suffering. This is what Blythe was referring to, the Avicii or whatever it is, hell, which is just the worst, the most extreme case. Basically, the lower realms, the realms below the human realm, are places where there's so much suffering that you never get any peace, you never get any ease, you never get any chance to rest. And so there's never any time to develop concentration or anything like meditation. In the upper realms are places where you don't have much motivation to practice because everything's already fine. And the human realm is not only a place where you have both the opportunity and the motivation to practice, but also where we can see karma working. It's not always bad. It's not always good. Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's good. And we can then ask why. Why are we sometimes happy? And why are we sometimes suffering? And that question can't really come up when you're always suffering or when you're always happy. Let's see, did I say any more? No, this is more other things. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And just in general, so one of the strategies that many Buddhist teachers have used over the decades of Buddhism in the West is to try to figure out, how much can Westerners take? What is going to be acceptable? What can they deal with? What won't push their buttons too much? And it's a difficult balance, because on the one hand, the Buddha himself said that it is absolutely necessary to use skillful means to reach people where they are. That the point isn't to rub people's faces in teachings that they're not ready to accept, or that just rubbed them the wrong way or whatever. The Buddha was always searching for ways of reaching people, and teaching them in ways of that they could understand and accept. On the other hand, you have to move beyond where you are. That's the point of the teachings, is to take you to some next step. And for whatever reason, over the centuries, Asian teachers, going back to the Buddha himself, used these teachings about hell a lot. And there's a funny story about what's his name? Oh, anyway, some Tibetan teacher who's very hardcore. And when he first started teaching in the West, he was very popular, but at the same time, his students were constantly telling him, Rinpoche, maybe a little less talk about the hells. He would give a retreat, and every talk would be these descriptions of hell realms. And his students would say, Rinpoche, maybe not so much, And he would also say, if you want to be my student, you cannot watch television. And his students would say, Rinpoche, maybe we can watch a little television, So, there, I mean, and then he would say, okay, you have to meditate more than you watch television. That was his compromise. So, teachers are always, and even though people like, I still can't think of this Rinpoche. He was a very famous guy. But I mean, if you're named Rinpoche, he was a tulku. He was a reincarnated, master, which supposedly means that people can, instantly look at you and see your karma and understand exactly what it doesn't really work that way. Teachers are constantly trying to figure out, and we're constantly, and so it's not just the teachers who are figuring out what they want to tell us. We also decide for ourselves, what are we going to listen to? What are we going to pay attention to? What are we going to set aside? What are we going to kind of pass over and say, now he's talking about hell. Yeah, okay, I don't really buy it, but or now they're talking about reincarnation. Nah, I don't believe in that stuff. And we filter in that way as well. We all have our filters, and and that's our intelligent minds at work. I mean, we have to we wouldn't have come to the Dharma if we hadn't kind of made choices about what we're interested in, what we don't like, what we do like, what we think is a good idea, and what we think is a bad idea. We have to work with that on the basis of what we understand, and you end up having to make what you can of things like heavens and hells and gods and goddesses and dragons and ghosts and yakshas. You asked about yakshas, Blythe? Well, we haven't talked about yakshas yet. Demons,
Yeah,
demons.
In fact, I have here one of the things that you're somewhat talking about now, I guess, when you're putting the different graduated levels, is I wrote that we'll always be in one of the following states: human being, animal, subhuman in hell, ghost, and the asuras. That those are the 5 things that we will always be in one of those existences.
Right, as long as we're in samsara.
So the point is, when we are in the human one, our suffering can actually make us feel like we're the subhuman and the.
Oh, absolutely.
So you can't experience those in one lifetime.
Right.
You don't just stay in one. Okay.
And we do experience that. When you're suffering, you're in hell. And it feels like it's never going to end. It feels like there's no stop. When you're but as soon as you're happy, you're in heaven, and you think all your problems are solved. At least I'm like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm manic depressive. I don't know. But um, and that's a little extreme. But it it gives us the opportunity to not just swing back and forth between those extremes, but to begin to ask why. Why am I sometimes happy and why am I sometimes suffering?
But Kurt, can we look at this also as that, well, okay, but at least we're in the elevator car, so to
Mhm,
speak.
mhm,
We're at the highest level in this station,
mhm,
and there are possibilities to do the right things that'll hit the button that'll take us up a
mhm.
couple floors, maybe.
Well, um, yeah. I mean, it's certainly not as simple as just hitting the right buttons, but in a way it is.
Right, right. Well, or at least to
Well,
put in some good
mhm,
karma that may not take you up to the penthouse,
mhm,
but it's at least going to keep you in the same station of human
mhm,
when you come back, and then
mhm.
like if you remember, and you go up, right?
Right. And I think it's important to emphasize that, at least from the standpoint of Buddhist teachings, that whenever we are happy, whenever we experience anything good in our life, it is because we have done good things in the past and that we are reaping the reward for that. Um, it's like, I mean, this is not something that is usually emphasized in the way Buddhism is taught to Westerners, but generally speaking, if someone is born into a good situation, from birth, you're born into a rich family or whatever. Um, Generally, that's seen as the result of generosity that you practiced in past lives. The problem is that as soon as we get into a good situation, you know, we don't necessarily remember our generosity. We don't put two plus two together and say, you know, oh, well, first of all, we don't realize it isn't going to last. So impermanence is very important. Um, and we don't realize how we got there in the first place.
Uh, uh, yeah. It's sort of like in the sutra when it's saying that, who was she, the golden-eyed girl that eventually became uh, Ksitigarbha.
Hmm.
When her mother was released way back, she was what, a child
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
of the lowest servant in the house.
Right.
So that,
Yes.
to sort of take into consideration the whole caste
Well,
system
yeah.
in place.
And in that case, so that's an interesting story, and actually, that's in chapter 4. Um, yeah. Let's take a 5-minute break, okay, and then come back and pick this up. Um, is that okay?
Mhm.
All right. Good.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So, where should we go from here?
Well, I didn't mean to, I know if my questions or comments take up what you've prepared tonight, maybe we could go with what you had down for information. You said you had some slides.
Well, I think it's much better for us to talk about what's actually on our minds than to, for me to, you can when I post the recording for this of this discussion, I'll put the slides up there with it, and you can make of them what you want. And if we run into anything that I think is relevant, although I do have one really pretty picture that I made. I'm kind of proud of. I spent too much time on this one slide. I'm going to show it. Let's see. Not that pretty of a picture, maybe. Who knows? We'll see. It is. So this is kind of looking at the setting of the sutra. Mount Meru is kind of the center of the Buddhist universe, at least for the part of the universe that we're in. The place that we live in is it's often referred to as Jambudvipa, which is basically on the south side of Mount Meru, down at the bottom. The Asuras that Blythe actually mentioned, also known as the jealous gods, they're kind of on the mountain, but down at the bottom. Up at the top of the mountain is where this Triastrimsis heaven place is. The important thing about this, the relationship between Mount Meru and Jambudvipa and Triastrimsa heaven, is that Triastrimsa heaven is the kind of the highest place in Buddhist cosmology that is still pretty much connected to us, and so it's relatively easy if you're a god or a Buddha to go back and forth between Triastrimsa's heaven and Jambudvipa, where we are. And so anyway, that's kind of the setting for the sutra, and I like this picture, but because I made it.
Hey Kurt, is the Mount Meru the same as Mount Sumeru with the SU in front of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sumeru Mountain, Mount Meru. Yeah.
All one and the same.
I think so. And you'll find lots of different this is when it gets to Buddhist cosmology, and even like which heavenly realm did the Buddha's mother ascend to after she died. There's disagreement about that. Some say it was Tushita heaven, some say it was Triastrimsa heaven. Where exactly are the Asuras? These are interesting things, but they're kind of.
Are there more heavens?
There's lots of heavens, yeah. Ask Elizabeth. Elizabeth is kind of an expert on the different realms, and they're all in samsara. So we think of samsara as someplace that is bad. There's a lot of great things in samsara, but it doesn't last. But sometimes it does if you play your cards right. If you go to anyway, and this is one of the things that when in the second chapter of the sutra, when all of the emanations of Ksitigarbha show up, all of the emanations come along with. So each of these emanations is a Ksitigarbha, and each of them has been busily saving beings who were condemned to hell, some hell realm, or some bad place. And so each of these Ksitigarbhas bring along with them these beings that they've been helping, and all of these beings have now reached the state where they haven't escaped from samsara, but they will never go back to the bad places again. And again,
what would be your definition of samsara? How would you say it?
Well, so samsara, like hell, comes from the mind. Okay, so Jambudvipa, Jambudvipa is the actual place where we live. Okay, and Jambudvipa is characterized by the fact that the jambu tree is here, and the jambu tree is the tree under which Siddhartha, when he was still fairly young, had his first experience of meditation. And so every Buddha is born into a land that has a tree like that. It's not the tree under which he became enlightened. It was the tree under which he discovered the practice that led to enlightenment. Okay, Jambu tree. So when we think of the place where we live as Jambudvipa, it's not such a bad place. And samsara is the mental state that people in Jambudvipa have. And it's also, and it is a mental state that people in other realms of samsara have. But there's in a different sutra, in the Vimalakirti Sutra, one of the Buddha's students asked him an impertinent question. He said to the Buddha, "So you're a Buddha, you're a fully enlightened Buddha, huh?" Which is already kind of an impertinent question. And then he said, "But Buddhas are supposed to reside in pure lands. Beautiful, wonderful pure lands. That's where Buddhists are supposed to reside. And I look around, I see you here, and I'm glad you're here because I need your teaching, but at the same time, this doesn't seem like a pure land to me." And the Buddha said, "Well, watch this." And then he touched one toe to the ground, and instantly everything around, for as far as this student of the Buddha could see, turned into a pure land. And so that especially in Zen, but not just in Zen, the teaching is that we see what's in our minds, and we see samsara because that's because of the karma that we still have to work on in our minds. But pure lands and heavenly realms, or nice places. One of the original Sanskrit for what people call Pure Land is Sukhavati, which just literally means good place, or a place of happiness. And we create all of that with our minds. And that's just basic Buddhist teachings. We create it all with our minds. It's like that's why the Buddha placed so much emphasis on things like meditation and working on ourselves. Joe, did you have something there?
Yeah, question. And this is sort of following out of Blythe's question too. Okay, we as humans know that we're in samsara, and the question is, do those that are below us in status, do they know that they are there and that it is a place of suffering? And the lower down you go, do they know that they are in the lowest place of suffering or not? To maybe help themselves, or if they were to encounter a Buddha, to say, "I'm glad you're here. I need your help."
Yeah. So if you're in a lower realm and Jijang Bosal or something, and it isn't only Jijang Bosal. We're talking about that because that's what we're talking about. But other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, in fact, I think it's in the second chapter, when all of these emanations of Ksitigarbha gather together, the Buddha says, "I'm just like this. I send out emanations all throughout the universe, and I appear in whatever form is, and in whatever place it will be helpful to other beings." And he goes through a list of all the different ways that he appears, including as ordinary men and women and kings and queens and dragons and gods and goddesses and trees and rivers and mountains and springs, and he says, and so it's not just this. We always think of the Buddha as Shakyamuni Buddha, but he says this isn't the only way that I manifest. So the point being that if you're lucky, if you're in a lower realm, And that's what Jijang Bosal in particular is dedicated to doing, is helping people who are in those places and teaching them in such a way that they're able to, get out.
Yeah. Well, with the appropriate skillful means,
Yeah.
or that being maybe in a lower place.
Right. Yeah.
That's a toad or something.
Yeah.
Interesting. But it's also interesting. I have to say that you had used the word manifestation to, and I was thinking, wow, that's just like encountering a Dharma gate when you sort of have that aha moment about some sort of gate. But also too, if as we look at what and where our practice may take us to, that the 10,000 return to one, so to speak, is that, yeah, sure he is. Sure
What's
he is.
that?
Yes, sure he is, but not necessarily as a manifestation or to be labeled as such, right?
I don't know what you like.
Yeah,
Not
sort of
as
the not separate, sort of how within our practice you get to the non-separate standing. But that, yeah, he has manifestations to help people. But is that just that, not separate? And when that being or person might recognize something, that's Buddha.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So just as the Pure Land is not somewhere else, the Buddha is not someone else. A great Chinese teacher said, when you realize that the Buddha does not come from somewhere else, you see the true Buddha. And people go further and say, that you have to become, you can't go to the Pure Land. The Pure Land is here. You can't meet, Amitabha. You have to become Amitabha. But then there's other teachers that say, well, have you become Amitabha yet? Probably not. So you still have work to do. Because sometimes people hear those teachings and they get ahead of themselves. And they say, oh, I don't need Amitabha because I am Amitabha. And, the first time you get, angry at someone, you realize you're not Amitabha. So what did you start us off with, Blythe? I can't remember in this round. We've kind of wandered along. Do you remember?
You mean since break?
Yeah, since the break.
No.
No? Okay.
I feel like I've been just making notes on the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah.
I didn't have a new one here.
Do you have anything, Elizabeth? Elizabeth always has something.
I thought this was an interesting characteristic of the hell. One of the characteristics listed was in that hell is a bed that extends for 10,000 miles.
You think this is interesting? This is one of the most sadistic passages in the whole sutra.
Well,
okay,
this is interesting. But
Sorry.
I think it has something interesting. One person undergoing punishment perceives his or her own body covering the entire bed. When hundreds of thousands of people undergo punishment simultaneously, each still perceives his or her own body covering the bed. So my understanding, and it says that is how retributions are undergone by those with the same karma. But what I thought was interesting about it was that there's really a whole lot of people who are suffering the same way that person is suffering, but they perceive just themselves as suffering.
Yeah.
I thought that was, you could interpret that.
Yeah.
So
That's a good point. I mean, I am sorry I was kind of, dismissive about, because I really don't like, I really do not like that passage.
I don't like it, but I just
Yeah, but the fact that our suffering, we get very, I mean, self-involved in our own suffering. We don't realize that we're sharing it with all
I
other
thought
beings.
it could be
Yeah,
interpreted that way,
yeah,
that
that's a
that
good
would
point.
be part of the suffering, would be that you thought you were the only person
Hmm.
suffering.
Yeah.
Although I never heard of hell as described that way, but that would be just what I would add.
Hmm.
I think it was interesting at some point when I was talking to Daniela and Dagok,
Hmm.
one of them made a point of, in talking about suffering, saying it's best to try to frame it, there is suffering, not I am suffering. That identifying factor that happens.
Hmm.
And they were suggesting that as you look at the language or as you're thinking of it, there is suffering is different than I'm suffering.
Hmm.
Right.
It sort of shifts something.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to ask Elizabeth that she'd never heard of something like that before. And I wanted to ask, first of all, that there is a bed available there,
Not a
or
good bit.
the
Yeah.
fact that you're sharing that bed with so many different beings that are, and the bed is burning iron, right? Molten iron. Is that correct?
A lot of iron.
Yeah.
A lot of iron in hell.
Wow. And that's interesting because, like, is that the center of the earth? The way that some people will think.
Hmm. It could
Where
be.
is that? Right?
Where is hell? Is it the center of the earth? Maybe. I don't know. Well, yeah,
In your mind. No.
in your mind.
That's kidding.
Okay, so we got about 10 minutes left. We are. So has everybody actually read all the first 4 chapters of the sutra?
I
Almost.
haven't finished the fourth one.
Okay, yeah, the
Yeah.
fourth one is kind of long. I mean, it it's it's. I would say it's not only long; it's a bit drawn out. But it also uh, has a lot of hells.
I was going to say I got kind of held out.
That's good.
It
That's
was
pretty
like,
good. I like that.
okay, I
Yeah.
get it. I get it. I get it. I know this place. I know this well.
Uh-huh.
So, I
Now,
mean,
are you a native Kentuckian, Blythe?
yeah, I was actually born in Michigan, but I
Oh,
grew up my whole
yeah.
life here.
Okay. And you're an Ohioan, Joe?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm a Hoosier, so we're
Uh,
Midwesterners. Elizabeth, I don't know. Elizabeth is from around the D.C. area, aren't you? Yeah. Yeah. East Coaster. East Coast, elitist. Um, but but us Midwesterners, we have, up close and personal experience with, the kind of teachings of heaven and hell that Blythe was referring to, at the beginning. And I was actually looking around at how other Buddhist teachers address these issues, and I found an interesting thing by Thich Nhat Hanh, which I can put a link to when I post the recording for this. But basically, Thich Nhat Hanh is saying, there's the teachings for the masses, and sometimes with the masses, you got to hit them with the hells, And I don't really buy that. I think that's a little too simplistic. He said, really, and then there was another one I found from a very interesting Tibetan nun. She said, I have a lot of students, they come to me and they say, I came to Buddhism to get away from heaven and hell. But it's like out of the frying pan and into the fire. You guys have so many heavens and so many hells. What's going on? What's up with that? So she has kind of a sense of humor about it.
Do you ever notice, as you're talking about this and you think about, especially in people chanting and praying to Jizo, how when there is suffering for someone, it is all consuming and so hard to get out of. And I've shared before that feeling of practicing doing everything you've ever heard possible to help move through and nothing happens. And all of a sudden you realize you've moved and you don't know why. Is that Jizo at work? Is that just, I just think I'm learning the older I get and the more I experience that there is suffering. I'm still identifying with it, but the more, it's almost like that concept of grace, I guess. It feels like I just wonder, as a sufferer, what do you notice about that?
Well, I mean, I would say, so grace, means something that you can't bring about, right? I mean, that's what grace is. You can't get grace. You can't go out and buy it. You can't obtain it. It just happens. And Buddhism doesn't have the term of grace, but it also has this concept of, the stuff that just happens, the stuff that is there that you can't do anything about, as opposed to the things as opposed to what you do with it when it does happen. Okay. And so when that comes to you, while you're doing some practice, or if it comes to you and you have some practice that's associated with it, then it should help. It should. What am I trying to say? Well, for one thing, you have to be a little careful. If you, it's like, be careful what you pray for, be careful who you pray to, because when that grace comes, then it will reinforce whatever it is that you are doing. Whatever that practice is that you're doing will be necessarily reinforced by that experience of grace. But the idea that you have about what it is that you're doing, what your practice is, what you're directing it at, who you're conceiving as, being on the other end of that prayer, or what it is that you're praying for, you're reinforcing that. And so you want to make sure that you're, doing something good, basically, because it will so people get, people don't always have necessarily good ideas about, what they're, or don't always get good they get reinforcement, but the reinforcement, you get cults, right? People who join cults get, reinforcement. They get results. They feel better. They experience grace, and then they associate it with what they're doing. And and I don't want to be judgmental. I've known people who have benefited greatly from being involved in things that I would consider to be cults, and I've heard stories from other people. It's not for me to judge anyone else's practice, but for myself, I feel like I need to be careful what I am, looking to, directing myself at, giving my attention to, because when I'm experiencing something like what Blythe was saying, then that will be, strengthened. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. It's interesting because I know in Cincinnati at the Zen Center, our teacher has used the grace word
Yeah.
in some of his Dharma talks and whatnot. It's always a word that I sort of recoil from, to tell you the truth. Because for me, it's like has connections with a Christian God.
Mhm.
Uh, by the grace of God or by the
Yeah,
grace of
right.
the Holy Spirit or
Mhm.
wherever. And to me, that's sort of like, or Amazing Grace, the song, where it makes me think like, oh, those are traditions that I really cannot um,
Mhm.
embrace. Okay. And so to me, when I hear it, I don't always necessarily have a positive view
Right,
of the word or that what situation.
right.
Just what you're saying. Someone may be in what looks like a cult and they receive a grace,
Mhm.
but it's still a cult. And
Right,
luckily your friends are still alive
right.
but to me, it's always a word that I'm very hesitant about. Like,
Yeah.
uh,
The, the, um, so in Buddhism, grace is called sudden enlightenment. That's what grace is in Buddhism. It means the thing that comes to you, because sudden in Buddhism, this word gets thrown around a lot in Zen, but not just in Zen. In lots of schools of Buddhism have this idea of sudden enlightenment. It means the stuff that comes to you that you can't do anything about. And people often think that their practice is in order to bring about enlightenment experiences, or enlightenment experience is another word for grace. Practice is really for how you work with those experiences. Your practice is what gives you the tools to do something with that experience when it comes to you. And so, if your practice is to sit in meditation, then when some enlightenment experience comes to you, um, you are working on, whatever it is that you're working on when you're meditating. But I would say you're working on, the process of inquiry. You know, so if you're working on the process of inquiry and some enlightenment experience comes to you, you don't say, "Ah, I've got it." You say, "What is that?" And you look into it further. You know, you go deeper with it, instead of latching onto it and thinking that you are now enlightened or that you've had some realization. You say, interesting, what is this? Where does this go? Where did it come from? So if
it's
you're yeah.
called Kensho. Is that what a Kensho is?
So Kensho literally means seeing nature. And so that's one word that you can use for it. Sure. Kensho, and so Kensho is, I would say, another word for grace. These are because you cannot bring about Kensho. True Kensho, and this is one of the teachings that, so Zen Master Negak does also use this word grace sometimes. Um, but he also often says enlightenment cannot be brought about. And he's talking about the same thing. Enlightenment cannot be brought about. So what are we doing? If we can't bring it about, what do you mean? Why are we sitting here? Why do we get up in the morning? Why do we chant? Why do we, because those are the tools that we learn how to use when it
Mhm.
does come about on its own, to work with it, to do something, constructive and positive with it, to help us to get,
That makes sense, and maybe it explains why so a Christian uh, or Jewish person might say by the grace of God, meaning they're not
well,
making it come about. It
right.
is coming from a source that.
And because we cannot bring it about, it means it doesn't just happen to us. It doesn't just happen to Zen people or Buddhists or anybody. It happens. It is it. In another word that Zen Master Nikak likes to throw around is birthright. It is our birthright to have these experiences. It is our birthright to have Kensho, to see the true nature of our minds. Um, and we all do that. We all have at least glimpses, you know. But what do we do with it?
Tell me, in those other traditions, and I know you may not be able to answer this, is it a birthright for them? for
Well,
for a Christian or Jewish person to have, that's my birthright, right?
that it so a lot of Buddhists would say that anybody who truly believes in original sin, then that is directly at odds with the Buddhist concept, at least, of Buddha nature, and that having that kind of realization is our birthright, is as a, our true inner nature. Um, Christians can argue around that. actually. There are a lot of really, really, really smart Christians.
But it's almost as if that birthright has been broken by the original sin and so forth,
and,
right?
right, and you can put that kind of, and Buddhists have that kind of argumentation too. We have Buddha nature, but it is covered by our, incalculable eons of bad karma from our own past actions. So is it really different? I would say that there is ultimately a fundamental difference, but a lot of times people, regardless of what their religion or philosophy or worldview is, they're all trying to describe the same thing. And some of the vocabularies are better than others, in my opinion. But if we all have Buddha nature, then that is what we're all striving towards. And it isn't emphasized, I don't think, a lot in the Ksitigarbha Sutra, but the Ksitigarbha Sutra is part of the category of sutras that really emphasizes Buddha nature, universal Buddha nature, and the fact that we are all on the path to Buddhahood. And so people, have different ideas about what that means. Obviously, not everybody thinks that their path to Buddhahood is Buddhism. That doesn't mean that they're not bodhisattvas on the path to Buddhahood.
Cool. Very interesting. Are they going to have a rude awakening at the end? If there isn't any, like,
well, if
we're Buddhist.
So if they're very lucky, they will have daughters who are Buddhists who pray for them. That's one of the take-home messages of the Ksitigarbha Sutra. If you are very lucky, you will have a daughter who is a Buddhist who will pray for you.
Very interesting.
And that will, and because of her prayers, Ksitigarbha will save you.
Cool.
So we're a little over time. I don't feel any particular. I don't want to go, too much over time. I don't feel any need to impose a strict time limit. And I like this discussion. I like the fact that we've mostly just talked about, what we've brought to this to talk about, and not talked about somebody's PowerPoint slides or mine or anyone else's. So I think that's good, and I hope we can continue to do that, going forward. There's a lot more in the Ksitigarbha Sutra. There's stuff, and chapter 3 is very short. We didn't really talk that much about emanations and what that's all about, and I do want to talk some more about that. But we'll meet again in 2 weeks from tonight. We'll still be talking about the first 4 chapters. I think it'll be good to spend a good 3 months talking about this sutra, and we can revisit difficult issues like heavens and hells, and it's important to look at those things. It's also important not to accept anything just because, the Buddha said it, so it must be true, or it's in this sutra, or whatever. We have to use our own intelligence to make of it what we can and what's of use to us.
I've often thought about, if it comes up in those further discussions, how powerful your consciousness is, your mind, your belief, whatever your spirituality. If what you believe, you create as your experience when you die.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
if I think it's lights out, and I truly believe that, lights out is what I would experience. If I believe there's a heaven and hell, if I believe there's a rebirth, that literally, could I end up creating that experience, or is the same thing going to happen to everybody? Doesn't matter what you twisted around and studied and worked on and practiced. So anyway, I throw that out there for further.
Yeah. No, and some people go even further and say that when someone else has died, that you pray for them, whatever it is that they have, imagined or wished for or prayed for their afterlife, may they get that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that seems perfectly reasonable. At the same time, if your mother has consistently said bad things about the Buddha Dharma, and you're afraid that she has gone to hell, then you should pray for her, or anyone else. And so you can always, if you have some confidence, if you have some sense that Ksitigarbha, that this really is genuine, then you can do that. At the same time, respecting other people's beliefs or desires or whatever. And yeah, and the one thing that I do have a very clear sense of is that when people die, you still have a sense of that person. You still have some connection to them. Maybe that connection is totally only on my side, but I feel like there's someone else on the other side as well. And doesn't mean I know what's happening with them. And so finding some way to express that, having a way that's meaningful to you to express that is good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
So we should let's end just with very simply reciting the 4 great vows together. I just happen to have one version of that up here. And you can see my screen, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I'll just I muted everybody except for me, but just this is one version of the 4 great vows. Sentient beings are numberless. We vow to save them all. Delusions are endless. We vow to cut through them all. The teachings are infinite. We vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is inconceivable. We vow to attain it. May whatever excellent qualities we have gained from this practice be extended for the benefit of all beings. So thanks everyone for coming and participating, and I will post this. It'll be up tomorrow, and there should be some links along with it if anybody wants to look at more PowerPoint slides. And think of stuff that we didn't get to tonight for next time. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Kurt.
Bye, everybody. Thanks a lot.